Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Dover Demon. It is a story that begins in the quiet, wooded corners of Massachusetts, where the trees lean heavy over narrow roads and the darkness feels thick enough to touch. Our journey takes us back to the year 1977, to a small town called Dover. It was a place of stone walls and rolling hills, a place where the silence of the night was rarely broken by anything more than the wind in the pines or the distant call of an owl. But on the night of April 21st, that silence was interrupted by something that defies explanation. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and the first tentative buds of spring. It was 10:30 in the evening, a time when the world usually settles into a deep, rhythmic slumber. For 3 teenagers driving through the rural landscape, however, the night was just beginning. They were young, full of the restless energy that comes with being 17, and they were about to encounter a mystery that would haunt their memories for decades to come. The driver was a young man named Bill Bartlett. He sat behind the wheel of a small, white Volkswagen, his hands loosely gripping the steering wheel as the car hummed along Farm Street. Beside him and in the back seat were his friends, Mike Matsaka and Andy Brody. The interior of the car was a sanctuary of flickering dashboard lights and the low murmur of conversation, a small bubble of warmth moving through the vast, ink-black New England night. Farm Street was a winding path, lined with ancient stone walls that had stood for generations, marking the boundaries of old farms and forgotten fields. The headlights of the Volkswagen sliced through the gloom, casting long, dancing shadows across the granite rocks and the tangled brush. Bill was a focused driver, but his eyes were also those of an artist. He noticed the way the light hit the textures of the world, the rough bark of the oaks, the glint of dew on the grass, and the deep, velvet shadows that seemed to pool in the hollows of the landscape. He didn't know that, in just a few moments, those artists' eyes would see something that no amount of logic could ever erase. As the car rounded a gentle curve, the beams of the headlights swept across a low, tumble-down stone wall on the right side of the road. At first, Bill thought he saw a common animal, perhaps a large dog or a stray cat navigating the uneven rocks. But as the car drew closer, the figure didn't flee. It remained perched there, perfectly still, as if it were a part of the masonry itself. Bill slowed the vehicle, his heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against his ribs. The light fully illuminated the creature, and the breath caught in his throat. It was not a dog. It was not a cat. It was something entirely alien to the woods of Massachusetts. The creature was roughly 3 to 4 feet tall, and it sat in a hunched, awkward position atop the stones. Its body was thin and spindly, with long, delicate limbs that looked far too fragile to support its weight. But it was the head that truly unsettled him. It was massive, shaped like a large melon or an egg, and it sat atop a slender neck that seemed to strain under the burden. There were no ears, no nose, and no mouth that Bill could discern in those fleeting seconds. Only a smooth, featureless face dominated by 2 enormous, glowing eyes. Those eyes were like twin marbles of burning orange, reflecting the headlights with a glassy, unblinking intensity. They weren't the eyes of a predator caught in the glare, but something deeper, something ancient and lost. Bill stared, mesmerized and terrified, as the car crawled past the spot. He could see the creature's skin now. It was hairless and smooth, with a strange, pale peach color that reminded him of the flesh tones used in the Sunday morning comic strips. In the harsh light, the skin looked almost translucent, yet it had a gritty, sandy texture, like the hide of a shark or fine-grained wet sandpaper. Most unsettling of all were the creature's hands. Long, thin fingers with exaggerated joints were wrapped tightly around the rough edges of the volcanic rocks. They looked like tendrils, curling and gripping the stone wall with a strength that contradicted their spindly appearance. The creature didn't move as the car passed. It simply watched, its melon-shaped head turning slowly to follow the light, its orange eyes never once losing their steady, haunting glow. The encounter lasted no more than 7 or 8 seconds, but in that brief window, the image was seared into Bill's mind with the clarity of a photograph. Inside the car, the atmosphere shifted instantly from casual boredom to sharp, electric tension. Bill gasped, his voice tight as he asked his friends if they had seen the figure on the wall. But Mike and Andy had been looking elsewhere, perhaps at a map or simply lost in their own thoughts, and they had missed the apparition entirely. They laughed at first, thinking Bill was playing a prank, but the look on his face stopped them cold. He was pale, his hands trembling as he gripped the wheel, and his eyes were wide with a genuine, primal fear. He didn't stop the car. He didn't turn back. He simply drove, his mind racing to categorize what he had just seen. Was it a prank, a deformed animal, or something that had slipped through a crack in the world? When he finally reached the safety of a home, Bill didn't wait to tell the story. He grabbed a piece of paper and a pencil, his artist's hand working feverishly to translate the terror into lines and shadows. He drew the thin body, the oversized head, and those piercing eyes. At the bottom of the sketch, he wrote a vow that would become famous in the annals of the unexplained. He wrote, "I, Bill Bartlett, swear on a stack of Bibles that I saw this creature." The night of April 21st did not end with Bill's sketch. While he sat in the flickering light of his room, trying to make sense of the impossible, the creature remained out there in the dark. It was moving through the woods of Dover, silent and lithe, its orange eyes searching the shadows of the trees. The teenagers didn't know it yet, but Bill wasn't the only one who would encounter the entity that night. Another witness was already walking toward a meeting with the unknown on a different road, just a mile away. The mystery was growing, stretching its spindly fingers across the town, weaving a web of sightings that would eventually earn the creature its name. For now, the town of Dover slept, unaware that a demon had been seen on Farm Street. But the air remained heavy, and the stone walls seemed to hold the chill of the encounter long after the Volkswagen's engine had cooled. The first chapter of the Dover Demon had been written in the glow of a teenager's headlights, and the darkness was only beginning to reveal its secrets. Sleep now, and let your mind wander the winding roads of Massachusetts, where the stone walls hide things that only the moon can truly see. The night of April 21st shifted into the early morning of April 22nd, with a heavy, clinging silence that only a small New England town like Dover can produce. The air was crisp, carrying the sharp, cool scent of damp pine needles and the lingering chill of a late Massachusetts spring. 15-year-old John Baxter was walking home alone, his footsteps creating a steady, rhythmic crunch against the gravel and pavement of Miller Hill Road. He had just left his girlfriend's house, and the warmth of that departure was slowly being eroded by the biting midnight air. The streetlights were sparse, casting long, stretching shadows that danced across the thick canopy of trees lining the road. Every few paces, the wind would catch the new leaves, creating a soft, dry rustle that sounded almost like a whisper in the dark. John adjusted his jacket, pulling the collar closer to his neck as he moved through the darkness. The road ahead was a ribbon of gray swallowed by the ink of the woods, a familiar path that tonight felt strangely elongated and hollow. He was roughly 1 mile from where Bill Bartlett had been driving just 2 hours earlier, though at this moment, John knew nothing of the orange-eyed creature that had gripped the stone wall on Farm Street. He only knew the weight of the silence and the sound of his own breath misting in the cool night air. As he reached a particularly dark stretch of Miller Hill Road, a silhouette emerged from the gloom ahead. It was a small, bipedal figure, standing perhaps 40 feet away, positioned right in the center of the path. John's heart did not skip a beat at first. Instead, he felt a wave of mild recognition. He had a friend in the neighborhood named M.G. Bouchard, a boy who possessed a somewhat larger, more prominent head than most. In the dim, trickling light of the moon and the distant haze of a single streetlight, the figure appeared to share that silhouette. John slowed his pace, squinting against the dark. He raised a hand in a tentative wave and called out into the stillness. He asked, "MG, is that you?" His voice felt small and thin against the vastness of the trees. There was no answer. The figure remained motionless for a heartbeat, a dark cutout against the woods. John took a few more steps forward, the distance closing to perhaps 15 feet. He called out again, his tone a mix of confusion and growing unease. He asked again, "Hey, who is that?" Still, the figure offered no greeting. It did not move like a person would, shifting its weight or checking a pocket. It simply stood, a miniature alien shape that defied the familiar contours of a teenage boy. Then, with a suddenness that made John recoil, the figure bolted. It did not run with the heavy, thudding gait of a human. It scurried with an agile, frantic speed, veering sharply off the road and disappearing into the dense, tangled brush of a wooded gully. Curiosity, that strange and often dangerous impulse, overcame the initial prickle of fear in John's chest. He stepped off the shoulder of the road, his shoes sinking into the soft, wet earth of the embankment. The gully was a shallow depression filled with the debris of winter, including rotting leaves, fallen branches, and the skeletal remains of thickets. He scrambled down the slope, the branches of low-hanging maples clawing at his sleeves like thin, desperate fingers. The sound of his own movement seemed deafeningly loud in the quiet of the woods. He pushed through a cluster of bushes, his eyes straining to follow the path the figure had taken. He could hear something moving ahead of him, a light, skittering sound that was too heavy for a squirrel but too nimble for a deer. The air down in the hollow was even colder, smelling of mud and stagnant water. He reached the bottom of the slope and looked across the small clearing toward the opposite bank. There, in the filtered light that managed to pierce the heavy branches, he saw it again. It had stopped near a large, gnarled tree, perched on a rock that rose out of the earth like a jagged tooth. John froze, his hand gripping a nearby trunk for balance. The creature was no longer running. It was waiting. Across the gully, not more than 30 feet away, the entity stood in stark relief against the dark bark of the tree. John stared, his mind racing to find a label, a name, or any logical explanation for the anatomy laid bare before him. The creature was small, standing between 3 and 4 feet tall, but its proportions were entirely wrong. Its head was massive, shaped like a large, upright egg or a distorted figure 8, resting atop a thin, fragile-looking neck. It had no visible ears, no nose, and no mouth that John could discern. But it was the eyes that drew his focus. Large, glassy, and dark, they seemed to glow with a faint, inner luminescence that had no specific color, just a haunting, vacant shine. The body was hairless and lean, with skin that appeared textured and rough, much like the surface of wet sandpaper. Its arms were impossibly long and spindly, ending in thin, tapering fingers that were wrapped tightly around the trunk of the tree, as if it were anchoring itself to the earth. Most disturbing to John were the feet. They were long and flexible, molded over the curve of the rock it stood upon, the toes gripping the stone with a prehensile strength. It looked like a biological impossibility, a hairless, monkey-like being with the head of a nightmare, standing perfectly still as it stared back at him with an intensity that felt heavy and sentient. The silence in the gully became absolute. In that moment, the sounds of the night, including the wind, the distant hum of the town, and the rustle of leaves, all seemed to vanish, leaving only the sound of John's heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The creature did not growl, did not hiss, and did not move a single muscle. It simply watched him. John felt a cold, primal dread wash over him, a realization that he was standing in the presence of something that did not belong in the woods of Massachusetts. He described the feeling later as a sense of being hunted, or perhaps observed by something that was contemplating a sudden, violent spring. Those large, lidless eyes did not blink. They were wide and staring, reflecting the meager light of the stars in a way that felt predatory and cold. The way its spindly fingers dug into the bark of the tree suggested a strength that belied its small stature. John began to back away, his movements slow and deliberate at first, as if he were trying not to startle a wild animal. He kept his gaze fixed on the figure-8 head and those glowing, vacant eyes. The creature remained perched on its rock, a silent sentinel in the shadows of Miller Hill, watching the boy retreat into the darkness. Once his feet found the solid, predictable surface of the road again, John did not look back. The curiosity that had led him into the gully was gone, replaced by a frantic, cold terror. He began to run, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps that burned his throat. The trees on either side of the road now felt like a gauntlet, their branches reaching out toward him as he fled toward the intersection of Farm Street. Every shadow seemed to hold the silhouette of that bulbous head. Every rustle in the grass sounded like those molded feet scurrying behind him. When he finally reached the more open stretch near Farm Street, a car's headlights cut through the gloom. A couple driving late through the quiet town saw the boy standing by the road, visibly shaken and pale. They pulled over, and John scrambled into the back seat, his hands trembling so violently he could barely speak. He told them he had seen something that was not a person and was not an animal. As the car sped away, leaving the shadows of Miller Hill behind, John Baxter stared out the rear window into the blackness of the woods. He did not know then that he was the second witness to a phenomenon that would haunt the town for decades. He only knew that the safety of his home felt a lifetime away, and the memory of those glowing, lidless eyes was now burned into his mind, an image he would soon put to paper in a sketch that would change everything. The clock had already moved past the final hour of April 21st, slipping quietly into the early minutes of Friday, April 22nd, 1977. In the small, wooded town of Dover, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the budding leaves of spring. The humidity of the day had settled into a cool, clinging mist that hung low in the hollows of the landscape, dampening the pavement and making the world outside feel heavy and muffled. For 15-year-old Abby Brabham, the night felt unremarkable at first, just the quiet conclusion to an evening spent with her friend, 18-year-old Will Taintor. They were traveling in Will's car, the rhythmic, steady hum of the tires against the asphalt providing a predictable, hypnotic backdrop to the darkness outside. The interior of the car was a small sanctuary of warmth and dim light, the dashboard glowing with a soft, amber hue that reflected faintly in the glass of the windshield. Outside that thin barrier of glass, the world was swallowed by a deep, impenetrable black, broken only by the two long cones of light projected from the headlights, which carved a lonely path through the sleeping forest. They were driving down Springdale Avenue, a winding, narrow stretch of road that felt much longer and more isolated under the heavy cover of midnight. The trees pressed close to the shoulders of the road, their branches reaching out like long, skeletal fingers against the moonless sky, casting flickering shadows that danced in the periphery of their vision. As they approached the area where the east branch of Trout Brook passes beneath the road through a narrow, dark culvert, the atmosphere seemed to shift, growing colder and more still. The sound of the engine was joined by the faint, trickling song of water moving over smooth stones in the darkness below. The air coming through the slightly cracked window was chilled, carrying the sharp smell of moss, wet stone, and the iron scent of the creek. It was here, near the small, unassuming bridge, that the mundane reality of the night began to dissolve. Abby sat in the passenger seat, her eyes tracing the line where the light of the car met the deep shadows of the brush, entirely unaware that in a few heartbeats, the quiet peace of the drive would be shattered by a sight that would haunt her thoughts for years to come. Suddenly, the headlights swept across a figure perched on the left side of the road, right at the edge of the culvert. At first glance, Abby's mind struggled to categorize what she was seeing, searching for a familiar shape in the unexpected silhouette. Her initial thought was that it was a person, perhaps a small child or a neighbor wandering the woods in the middle of the night. But the posture was entirely wrong, alien and unsettling. The figure was crouched on all fours, its body hunched over as if it were bracing itself against the cool concrete of the bridge or the damp, muddy earth beside it. It looked strangely like an ape for a fleeting second, but as the car drew closer and the beam of light became more direct, the animal comparison failed just as quickly as the human one. The creature was sitting perfectly still, its presence so unexpected and so fundamentally out of place that the air in the car seemed to grow thin and stagnant. Will continued to drive, his focus remaining on the road ahead, but Abby's gaze was locked on the entity that had appeared out of the void, a pale specter in the wash of their high beams. The light from the car illuminated the creature with a stark, unforgiving clarity that allowed every disturbing detail to surface. Its skin was entirely hairless, appearing smooth yet strangely textured, with a pale, tan or beige color that reminded Abby of wet sand, or perhaps the soft, vulnerable underbelly of a creature that never saw the sun. It was small, perhaps no more than 4 feet in length if it were to stand, but its proportions were jarringly distorted, defying the natural symmetry of any known animal. Its limbs were long and spindly, looking far too thin and fragile to support the weight of the massive, bulbous head that sat atop its slender, almost non-existent neck. The head was shaped like a large, elongated watermelon or a heavy figure eight, disproportionately large compared to the rest of its emaciated body. There were no visible ears to catch the sound of the car, no nose to breathe the damp night air, and no mouth that Abby could discern in those frantic seconds. It was a face defined by absence, a smooth expanse of pale skin that offered no familiar human expression to ground her fear. From the center of that featureless face, 2 large, round eyes stared back at her with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. Unlike the orange, marble-like eyes described by Bill Bartlett just 24 hours earlier, the eyes Abby saw glowed with a vivid, crystalline green. They were wide and lidless, catching the light of the headlamps and reflecting it back with a brilliance that felt deliberate, as if the creature were looking directly into her soul through the glass of the window. There was a glassiness to them, a brilliant, emerald sheen that seemed to vibrate against the deep darkness of the surrounding woods. The gaze was steady and unblinking, fixed upon the passing car with a cold, ancient curiosity that bypassed any sense of animal fear. Abby felt a cold shiver race down her spine, a primal reaction to the realization that she was being watched by something that did not belong in the woods of Massachusetts, or perhaps any woods she knew. The green glow lingered in her vision even as the car began to pull past the culvert, the twin orbs of light remaining the only visible part of the creature, as the rest of its body faded back into the gloom of the brook. Panic flared in Abby's chest, sharp and immediate, and she urgently told Will to drive faster, her voice tight with a fear she couldn't fully explain or contain. Will, who had only caught a brief, confusing glimpse of something tan and large-headed in the periphery, felt the sudden, electric tension in the car and pressed his foot to the accelerator. As they sped away from Springdale Avenue, leaving the Trout Brook culvert and the silent watcher behind in the dust, the silence between them became heavy and suffocating. Will had heard whispers of what Bill Bartlett had seen on Farm Street, but he remained quiet at first, gripped by his own uncertainty. He wanted to test the validity of what Abby had seen without influencing her with the details of the previous night's horror. He asked her to describe exactly what she had witnessed, and as she spoke of the hairless body, the watermelon head, and those piercing green eyes, the chilling consistency of the Dover demon began to take undeniable shape. This third witness, providing a matching description from a different location, solidified the encounter as more than just a trick of the light, weaving Abby's fear into the very fabric of the town's growing legend. The air in Dover remained heavy with the residue of that strange, electric week in April of 1977. The initial shock had begun to settle into a thick, uncomfortable silence that draped over the town like the fog rising from the Charles River. It was into this quietude that a man named Loren Coleman arrived. A researcher of the unexplained, he moved with a deliberate, soft-spoken precision that seemed to match the gravity of the stories circulating through the local high school. He stepped out of his car, the tires crunching softly on the gravel, and took a deep breath of the damp, cool air. The smell of thawing earth and pine needles was sharp. He was not there to judge or to scoff. He was there to listen, to document, and to see if the fragments of fear could be assembled into a clear picture. He carried with him a notebook and a sense of patience that felt as solid as the ancient stone walls that lined the winding roads of Massachusetts. The first interview took place in the familiar domestic warmth of Bill Bartlett's home. Inside, the light was low and amber, casting long shadows across the wooden table where Bill sat. The rhythmic ticking of a wall clock provided a steady, hypnotic pulse to the conversation. Bill was only 17, his hands still carrying the slight tremor of a young man who had seen something that defied every law of nature he had ever been taught. Loren Coleman sat across from him, leaning in slightly, his voice a gentle murmur that encouraged the details to surface. Bill reached for a piece of paper, his fingers brushing against the grain of the wood. He picked up a pencil, the graphite tip sharp and dark. As he began to draw, the only sound in the room was the rhythmic, scratchy whisper of the lead moving against the paper. It was a slow, meditative process, each stroke of the pencil, a desperate attempt to translate a nightmare into a physical reality. Under the flickering light of the kitchen, the image began to take shape. It was not an animal anyone recognized. Bill described the creature's skin as having the texture of wet sandpaper, a rough, peach-colored surface that felt alien even to describe. He drew the head first, a large, disproportionate shape that he likened to a watermelon or a bloated egg. There were no ears, no nose, and no mouth. It was a face defined entirely by its absence of features, save for two massive, glowing eyes. Bill colored them a deep, vibrant orange, like two marbles of fire caught in the headlights of his Volkswagen. He sketched the body next, thin and gangly, with spindly arms and legs that looked as fragile as glass. The most haunting part was the fingers, long, thin, and tapering into delicate points that had gripped the stones of the wall with an effortless, terrifying grace. Above the sketch, with a hand that did not waver, Bill wrote the words that would haunt investigators for decades. I, Bill Bartlett, swear on a stack of Bibles that I saw this creature. Loren Coleman did not stop there. He moved through the town, seeking out the other witnesses before their stories could be mudded by the gossip of the school hallways. He found John Baxter, a 15-year-old who had encountered the entity just 2 hours after Bill, on Miller Hill Road. John's description was chillingly consistent. He spoke of a figure that stood upright against a tree, its feet molded around the rocks at its base like the roots of the wood itself. As John described the scene, Loren could almost feel the chill of the midnight air on that dark stretch of road. John's sketch showed the same bulbous head and the same needle-thin limbs. While Bill had seen orange eyes, John recalled them as a pale, colorless glow, like two dim lamps in the forest. The similarity between the two drawings, made by two boys who had not yet shared their experiences with one another, was a weight that Loren felt deeply. It was as if they were all looking at the same impossible thing from different angles. The third piece of the puzzle came from Abby Brabham. Only 15 years old, she had been sitting in the passenger seat of a car on Springdale Avenue the very next night when the headlights swept across a figure huddled near a bridge. Her account added a new, startling detail. While the shape of the head and the hairless, beige skin matched the others perfectly, she insisted that the eyes she saw were a brilliant, luminescent green. Coleman listened as she described the way the creature sat on all fours, its body poised like a gargoyle in the shadows. The way she spoke was measured and certain, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet room. She drew her own version of the being, and when Lauren placed it alongside the sketches from Bill and John, the alignment was undeniable. 3 teenagers, 3 separate locations, and one singular, terrifying vision that had somehow invaded their quiet lives within a span of 26 hours. It was during these quiet, intense days of investigation that Lauren Coleman first uttered the name that would stick to the case forever: the Dover Demon. The name seemed to capture the mixture of localized mystery and otherworldly dread that had settled over the community. He looked at the collection of drawings spread out before him, the watermelon-shaped heads, the lidless eyes, and the spindly, grasping fingers. There was a profound silence in the room as he realized that these were not just the doodles of bored teenagers. They were testimonies. The sketches served as a bridge between the seen and the unseen, a permanent record of a window in time where the veil between the known world and something much darker had worn thin. The investigation had moved past simple rumors. It had become a pursuit of a ghost that had left its mark in graphite and lead, a phantom that refused to be forgotten as the news began to spread far beyond the borders of this small, quiet town. The name given by Coleman hung in the air like a heavy fog, settling over the town of Dover and transforming its quiet, suburban identity into something far more enigmatic. To understand why this name resonated so deeply, one must first visualize the landscape where these encounters unfolded. Situated roughly 15 miles southwest of the bustling energy of Boston, the town of Dover in 1977 was a place of deep, intentional stillness. It was a community characterized by its rolling hills and a stubborn adherence to its rural roots. Unlike the surrounding sprawl of urban development, Dover felt like a sanctuary of preserved antiquity. Here, the narrow, winding roads were lined not with streetlights, but with ancient, crumbling stone walls that had been meticulously stacked by hands centuries ago. These walls, crafted from weathered granite and moss-covered fieldstones, acted as low-slung boundaries between the world of men and the wild, untamed growth of the New England woods. On those nights in late April, the air was crisp, carrying the sharp, clean scent of damp earth and the faint, sweet musk of awakening pine needles. The darkness there was not a mere absence of light, but a thick, velvet presence that seemed to swallow the sound of every footfall and every distant engine. Farm Street, where the first sighting took place, was a stretch of asphalt that cut through a particularly dense canopy of white pine, birch, and maple trees. As the headlights of Bill Bartlett's small car swept across the roadside, they illuminated a world of stark contrasts. The silver-gray bark of the birches standing out against the deep, impenetrable shadows of the evergreens. It was in this specific geographical pocket, a place where the barrier between the domestic and the wild felt thinnest, that the first theory began to emerge among the skeptical. Some suggested that what the teenagers had witnessed was nothing more than a misplaced moose calf. They argued that a young moose, separated from its mother and wandering through the unfamiliar brush, might appear grotesque to an untrained eye in the flicker of a passing headlight. Proponents of this theory pointed to the gangly, disproportionate legs of a calf and its large, bulbous head as a possible match for the creature's silhouette. They imagined the animal, perhaps confused and startled, rearing up on its hind legs or clinging to the rocky terrain in a way that looked humanoid from a distance. The thought was comforting to some, a way to ground the supernatural in the familiar biology of the forest. However, the moose-calf theory began to crumble under the weight of geographical and biological facts. In the spring of 1977, the moose population had not yet returned to eastern Massachusetts. They were virtually non-existent in the region at that time. Furthermore, a calf's head is relatively small compared to its bulky, rectangular body, a direct contradiction to the witnesses' descriptions of a massive, watermelon-shaped skull perched atop a spindly, emaciated frame. Coleman himself was quick to point out the most jarring detail that separated the sighting from any known animal: the hands. Bill Bartlett and John Baxter had both described long, thin, tan-colored fingers that wrapped around the stones and tree trunks with a grip that was undeniably primate-like, or perhaps even something else entirely. Moose have hooves, rigid and unyielding, incapable of the delicate, tactile manipulation described by the boys. The skin of the creature was another point of departure. It was described as hairless and textured like fine-grained sandpaper or shark skin, shimmering with a soft, peach-colored hue. There was no fur, no velvet, no familiar animal musk, only a silent, hairless form that moved with a fluidity that defied the clumsy gait of a young ungulate. This lack of a biological fit led many to look toward the stars. The extraterrestrial theory gained significant traction, especially as the creature's appearance mirrored the emerging archetype of the gray alien. Yet there was a crucial distinction that made the Dover sightings unique in the annals of ufology. Usually, such encounters are preceded or followed by reports of strange lights in the sky, humming metallic crafts, or missing time. In Dover, there were no silver discs hovering over the pines. There were no beams of light or electronic interference. The creature appeared as a solitary wanderer of the woods, a biological entity that seemed at home in the dirt and the shadows. This led some to whisper of an interdimensional origin, a being that had perhaps slipped through a temporary rift in the fabric of the woods, a visitor from a place where the laws of biology followed a different, more alien rhythm. They saw it not as a pilot of a starship, but as a lost creature from a parallel reality, stumbling through the New England brush for a few brief hours before fading back into the ether. The eyes were the center of this theory, those large, lidless orange orbs that seemed to glow with an internal luminescence, reflecting the curiosity and the fear of a being completely out of its element. As the investigation deepened, the silence of the woods seemed to grow more profound. The geography of Dover, with its hidden ponds and secluded estates, provided the perfect stage for such a fleeting mystery. For 26 hours, the town was a theater for the impossible, a brief window where the ordinary was suspended. The theories, whether of a moose, a monkey, or a visitor from another world, all attempted to fill the void left by the creature's departure. But the woods remained unmoving, their secrets locked behind the silver bark of the birches and the ancient stone walls. The teenagers who saw it would carry the memory of those orange eyes for the rest of their lives, a reminder of the night the silence of Dover was broken by something that should not have existed. Even now, if you were to drive down Farm Street on a moonless night, you might find yourself leaning closer to the windshield, searching the shadows of the stone walls, wondering if the woods are truly as empty as they seem. The mystery of the Dover demon does not lie in the answers we find, but in the questions that remain whispered among the trees, long after the headlights have faded into the distance. The year 1977 has long since drifted into the soft, gray folds of history. In the town of Dover, Massachusetts, the seasons continue their rhythmic march, much as they always have. The winters are sharp and white, the summers thick with the hum of cicadas, and the springs, those fleeting, damp windows of time, remain heavy with the scent of waking earth and pine needles. But for those who remember the 21st and 22nd of April in that year, the spring holds a different quality. It is a season of echoes. The town itself, sitting quietly 15 miles southwest of Boston, has not changed its fundamental character. It remains a place of winding roads, ancient stone walls, and deep, encroaching woods. Yet, beneath the veneer of this upscale commuter haven, there is a pulse that never quite settled back into a normal rhythm. The mystery of the creature with the watermelon-shaped head and the glowing orange eyes did not vanish when the sun rose on the 23rd of April. Instead, it sank into the soil, becoming part of the local lore, a shadow that stays just out of reach of the street lamps on Farm Street and Miller High Hill Road. Consider the witnesses, whose lives were irrevocably touched by those 26 hours of strangeness. Bill Bartlett, who was only 17 when he saw that peach-colored entity perched upon a broken stone wall, grew up to be an artist of significant skill. Perhaps it was his artist's eye that allowed him to capture the creature so vividly on paper that night. His sketches are iconic now: thin, spindly limbs, a bulbous head, and those lidless, glassy eyes. He would later say that he felt a sense of embarrassment at times, a wish that he hadn't seen what he saw, yet he never wavered. He even swore on a stack of Bibles that his account was true. There is something profoundly quiet and steady about a witness who does not seek fame, but simply carries the weight of an impossible truth. Then there was John Baxter, only 15, walking home at midnight, seeing a figure he thought was a neighbor until he realized its proportions were all wrong. And Abby Brabham, whose sighting near Springdale Avenue confirmed that the creature was moving, perhaps migrating along a straight 2-mile line through the heart of the town. These teenagers, now adults with lives and families of their own, remain the guardians of a story that has no ending. They were not looking for a monster. They were simply moving through their lives when the unknown decided to cross their path. The investigation, led by men like Walter Webb and the renowned cryptozoologist Loren Coleman, who gave the creature its haunting name, attempted to bring logic to the illogical. They looked for tracks in the soft mud and found nothing. They interviewed the teenagers separately and found their stories to be remarkably consistent. Skeptics, of course, offered their own explanations. They spoke of moose calves or foals, wandering lost and out of season. They spoke of snowy owls with wings spread wide, caught in the sudden glare of high beams. They even whispered of hoaxes and school vacation pranks. But none of these explanations quite fit the puzzle. A moose does not stand on 2 legs and grasp a stone wall with tendril-like fingers. A snowy owl does not possess a watermelon-shaped head or a pale, hairless, peach-colored skin. The theories remain just that, theories, drifting like fog over the surface of the town's hidden ponds. The absence of copycat sightings in the decades since 1977 is perhaps the most compelling evidence of all. If it were a hoax, surely others would have tried to replicate the thrill. But the Dover demon was a singular event, a brief tear in the fabric of the everyday that closed just as quickly as it had opened. Today, the town of Dover embraces its legend with a quiet, New England dignity. At the Samhain Museum, managed by the Dover Historical Society, visitors can find exhibits dedicated to the creature. There are T-shirts that ask, "Do you believe?" and books that detail every turn of those dark roads. The Dover demon has become a cultural touchstone, appearing in comic books and television specials, a symbol of the enduring human fascination with what lies beyond our understanding. Yet, when you drive down Farm Street late at night, when the moon is a thin sliver and the shadows of the oaks stretch long across the pavement, the commercial side of the legend fades away. You find yourself glancing at the old stone walls, half expecting to see a pair of orange eyes reflecting your headlights. You feel the silence of the woods, a silence that seems to hold its breath. The geography of the sightings, a straight path through the trees and over the rocks, suggests a creature with a purpose, a traveler passing through our world on its way to somewhere else. We are left only with the echoes of its footsteps and the sketches of its haunting face. As we reach the end of our journey through the shadows of Dover, we must accept that some mysteries are not meant to be solved. They exist to remind us that the world is larger and stranger than we often care to admit. The woods are deep, the night is long, and there are things moving in the periphery of our vision that defy classification. The Dover demon remains a ghost of the 1970s, a memory of a time when the impossible came to a small Massachusetts town and sat upon a stone wall for just a moment. The air in Dover is still now. The trees are motionless. The orange eyes have dimmed, and the spindly fingers have let go of the rocks. Whatever it was, wherever it came from, it has found its peace in the hidden corners of our imagination. We can stop searching the roadside now. We can let the questions go unanswered. The story is complete, winding down like the last few miles of a long drive home. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.